All right. Can everybody hear me okay? I've got two microphones. One's recording the presentation. The other one is for the audio in the room. So this presentation, along with several hundred other presentations, will be available on our YouTube channel. And if you missed, we had a great set of forage conferences last week. They were called Kicking the Hay Habit, talking about reducing hay feeding, not eliminating, but reducing it in grazing systems. All those videos, there were a really good slate of presenters. All those videos are available on our YouTube channel. So if you get an opportunity to go on there and take a look at those, it's definitely worth your time. I'd like to thank Daniel and Clint for inviting me to come speak to you tonight. Clint had some topics he wanted me to touch on. I'm going to touch on most of those topics tonight. And the main one was thinking about pasture renovation. And everybody's in the room saying, well, it's a little bit late now, right? And it is a little bit late, but really what I want you to think about is from now about 12 months out. What are we going to do in that interim period between when we can seed cool season grasses again? And that's kind of what I want to focus on tonight. Number of reasons to reseed pastures. You know, we've got abandoned pasture land, or even surface mine land that's kind of coming into production. We need to think about what we can do to improve the productivity in those pastures. We've got pastures that were all torn to pieces last winter that we never got a good stand on, and then came the time this fall when we were supposed to overseed these pastures, and they got so dry in late summer this year and fall that we just never had the chance to get in there and get those reseeded. One thing that I want to make sure everybody understands is that when we talk about pasture renovation, we automatically think about reseeding those pastures. And while reseeding is certainly part of pasture renovation, it doesn't always mean that we have to go in and establish a new stand. A lot of times if we just change how we're managing those pastures, we'll make a big dent and improve the pasture productivity. So tonight I want to talk about several things, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I've got a longer presentation that covers these in greater detail, but I want to remind everyone of renovation principles. And those include things like soil fertility and grazing management and weed control in pastures, and then overseeding with legumes on a kind of a regular basis. And then I want to take some time and focus on renovation strategies that we can use from now and until the next 12 months and think about how they might fit into your grazing system as we move forward. And then the last thing I want to touch on, just 2 slides, is hay testing. We put up a lot of hay this spring. Some of it was better than others. Last winter we saw animals coming into diagnostic labs that had full bellies, but they were in pre-starvation stages. And that's because the hay quality was so low last year, and I'm afraid we've got some low quality hay again this year in the system. So hay testing, if you haven't done it, is going to be pretty important as we move forward. All right, let's talk real quick about a few principles. In soil fertility is the first one. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Clint has probably told everybody in this room 100 times, get a soil test. And I hope everybody's done that. I kind of got my doubts though. But really, getting a soil sample is the basis of a good soil fertility program. And you want to get a good soil sample. You want to be representative of what you have. And then from there, you can start to make decisions on soil fertility. If we don't have good soil fertility, it's just going to be really hard to have a productive pasture. And that's the bottom line. So just make sure you get a representative sample. You want to get at least 20 cores. You want to sample at the proper depth. Sometimes I take for granted that people understand that when we sample for a pasture, we want to be 3 to 4 inches deep for a soil test. A young man that was where we were doing some demonstrations this summer sampled his pastures for me. He was sampling, well, as deep as he could get the soil probe in, about 10 or 12 inches. And that doesn't give you a good soil test. You want to make sure you avoid atypical areas. So when you're sampling a pasture, atypical area will be anywhere where animals congregate at. Feed areas, water, shade areas, anywhere where they're concentrating nutrients through dung and urine, we don't want to include that in the soil test because it'll give us a false reading. All right, grazing management. Oh, we got a question?
Like on alfalfa, would you sample it since it's such a deep-rooted plant?
Maybe a little bit deeper, but probably not past 6 inches because a lot of the fertility that we're applying to pastures are going to be concentrated in the upper 6 inches of soil. So sometimes when you get too deep, we will lose some fertility that is actually there in the top layer of soil. Is there a question in the back? So the question was, he read an article saying we should be applying more nitrogen to our cool season pastures that are mixtures of clover and grass. And I'm not sure who wrote that article, but generally speaking, what the soil testing manual recommends is 30%. If we've got 30% clover, we should be meeting the nutrient needs of our grass in that pasture. Now, can we increase the total production? Maybe a little bit with additional nitrogen, but I'm not sure that it's going to be economical in most years. So, any other questions on fertility before we move on to grazing management? All right, good. So I want to talk just real briefly about grazing management. So when we think about pasture renovation, we really want to think about an integrated approach that involves things like soil fertility and grazing management. And grazing management is pretty important in terms of pasture renovation, especially during critical periods, and we'll talk about a couple of those critical periods in a minute. So the first thing I want to mention is rotational stocking. Implementing rotational stocking, so if you move from a continuous to rotational stocking system, will increase pasture productivity somewhere in the range of 30 to 40%. Just through management, I mean, it's pretty substantial. So if you're in a situation where you're not really managing grazing, I mean, this is something you could do that's not going to cost you a lot of money, but will bring big benefits back. And when we implement rotational grazing, we're managing two things. We're managing how close they graze, so residual leaf area, and we can kind of think of the leaf area in a pasture as a big solar panel. The closer we graze, the smaller that solar panel gets, and the longer it's going to take that pasture to regrow. So we're managing that, and then we're managing carbohydrate reserves or energy reserves in that plant. So we want high energy reserves in the plant because that's going to fuel regrowth after grazing. It's going to help our pastures persist through stresses like drought and excessive water. It's going to help our pastures regrow in the spring if we've got a good carbohydrate status. And we manage the carbohydrates by resting pastures between grazing events. So the two things we manage is leaf area, how close we graze it, and then how long we rest the pastures. And that helps with carbohydrate reserves. The third thing that rotational grazing does is it's really a powerful tool in terms of managing botanical composition of pastures. What do I mean by that? Well, just by how we manage a pasture, we can impact what forage species are dominant within that pasture. So say, for example, we had a Bermuda grass tall fescue mixture, and we wanted to shift that composition away from the tall fescue towards the Bermuda grass for summer grazing. Well, what we can do is we can put a little nitrogen on in late spring, early summer, and then we graze hard. Just by managing that grazing, we'll shift that botanical composition or the plants that are dominant in that sward towards the Bermuda grass. And vice versa, we could shift back towards cool season grasses with that mixture, tall fescue, by raising our grazing height and letting it shade out the Bermuda grass. So same way with white clover in cool season grass mixtures. If we see our stands becoming dominated by white clover, we raise our grazing height a little bit. That favors our cool season grasses, and that stand will help shift that composition over time back towards those taller growing cool season grasses. Normally we'll see a lot of low growing white clover in pastures where we're grazing a little bit too tight. So grazing management is really a tremendously powerful tool in terms of managing botanical compositions in pastures. So I want to talk about grazing management in terms of too much and not enough water. And we can't predict or prevent a drought from happening, but what we can do is we can manage for regrowth. And when I say manage for regrowth, I don't mean just manage pastures after a drought happens, but we need to be managing pastures all the time so that they're tolerant of drought. One of the things that happens when we implement rotational stocking is that we're impacting just not the plant above the ground, but also the plant below the ground. So pastures that are rotationally stocked will have a stronger root system, and those pastures will grow longer into a drought and come out of that drought faster. That's one of the first things people notice when they switch to a rotational stocking system, is that their pastures are more drought tolerant. So this is just kind of my drought management checklist. In all these things that I'm showing you, there's a half an hour or an hour presentation on each one of these, and this includes this drought management. But we want to maintain soil fertility. So when we maintain soil fertility, we're taking one stress away from that pasture when it undergoes drought. We want to allow pastures to acclimate to drought stress. One of the worst things we can do is if we have a pasture that hasn't fully regrown and we get around in our rotation and we go in there and we just graze it off to the ground as it's going into a drought stress, that's a really stressful situation for that pasture. So we want those plants to adapt to that drought stress. And if I had time, we could talk about it, but there's a specific number of things that happens in the plant as it adapts to drought stress. It's not like taking a light switch and going from well water to drought stress. That plant actually adapts to that drought stress and goes through specific physiological things within the plant as that drought occurs. We want to rest pastures both during a drought stress and also after the drought stress is over. We want to leave plenty of leaf area. And this is important for several reasons. One, it allows that plant to adapt to that drought stress. It allows photosynthesis to store up sugars and carbohydrates, which makes the plant more tolerant of drought stress. And the other thing it does is kind of interesting. So when we graze a pasture close, we tend to increase the temperature at which the pasture, the grass plants or the crown of the grass plant is exposed to. And this is kind of what this study shows. I had an undergraduate student who did a little study where he took temperature probes and he put them at the crown level of the plant, so that's right on the soil surface where the grass plant is. And then he defoliated those grass stands, that was a tall fescue stand, to either 1 inch or 4.5 inches, and he did that weekly, or he did 4.5 inches monthly. And he measured the crown temperature of that plant. And that's kind of what I want to point out. On these hot days, when it was 90 or 95 degrees, just changing the defoliation height in that pasture from 1 inch to 4.5 inches, we had about a 12 to 15 degree difference in the crown temperature of the plant. So just through grazing management, we can modify what we call the microclimate near the soil surface, or that severity of temperature that plant's exposed to. And that can really help a cool season grass plant survive a drought stress during the summertime by leaving a little bit of leaf area on it. And then eventually, if we come through our grazing system, so if we're rotational stocking and we come back to our first pasture and it hasn't regrown because of a drought stress, the worst possible thing to do, and a lot of people do it, is just open all the gates up and let those animals roam around the farm and pick at whatever green thing they can find. What we need to do in that situation is put those animals in a sacrifice area and feed some hay. And you'll still have some grass and pastures, and your neighbors will make fun of you, but it's okay. Because after that drought stress is over, your grass is going to regrow and your neighbor's grass is not going to regrow. So it's important that you protect your pasture stands during a drought stress by designating a sacrifice paddock and feeding a little bit of hay. Choose your weakest paddock that's in need of renovation anyways and feed some hay there. Ideally, what you want to do is avoid multiple stresses. So during a drought, you don't want pasture plants to be fertility stressed. You don't want them to be overgrazed. You want to avoid multiple stresses. We always say that drought killed our pasture, but really, probably what killed the pasture was poor management prior to the drought. And the drought was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. So it kind of comes along and everything's adding up, and then we throw a drought on top of it and our pasture plant dies, and we say, good Lord, it was the drought that killed my pasture. No, it was poor fertility and poor grazing management prior to that drought that really killed the pasture. All right, let's talk just a little bit about managing pastures during periods of excessive moisture. I wish I had a great solution for this, but I don't have one. But I'll give you a couple thoughts at least. One thing that we can do if we're in a rotational grazing system is speed up the time in which we move animals from one area to another. And by doing that, what we're doing is spreading that impact out over a larger area. So just speeding your rotation up, moving animals through that system faster will help to move that impact, to limit that impact to one certain area. Move that impact, lessen it over one area and move it over the whole pasture area. And then eventually, if it gets bad enough and you got so much moisture, you just need to put them somewhere and accept that you're just going to tear that paddock to pieces. And that's just going to get renovated next spring. So not a great solution, but that's what happens in the real world. As far as hay feeding, if you can move hay feeding points around and again move that impact around your pastures rather than having it all in one area, may be a good solution. Move to a sacrifice area if it gets too bad and just let the animals in there and feed hay in that sacrifice area. Try to choose a pasture that's already in need of some renovation and has good surface drainage is ideal, but they're still going to make a mess. And then, of course, if you have a hardened feeding pad to feed hay on, then feed some hay there. Feeding pads are nice because they hold animals up, but the bad part about feeding animals in one spot is that you're concentrating nutrients in that spot. And it's always better in a grazing system if you can move those nutrients and try to get them distributed as evenly as possible over a pasture. And we do that by moving hay feeding points around that pasture. So it's not ideal concentrating nutrients, but sometimes we do things to get through that aren't 100% ideal. Talk just real quick about weed control in pastures. Often we say weeds are a problem, and weeds are the problem in our pasture. And really, in many cases, they're a symptom of some other underlying problem. And I think it's important to understand that we're always going to have some weeds in pastures, but if we manage our pastures well, cattle will graze a lot of weeds in pastures. When we start to have a lot of weeds in our pastures, then we need to think about if there's something else wrong with our management program. Are we grazing too close? Are we getting broom straw because our phosphorus is too low? Do we need lime on our pastures? Is there something else going on that's causing this underlying weed problem? In a pasture, the soil's not going to be bare long. The good Lord's going to put a Band-Aid on it, and usually that Band-Aid is some type of a weed in a pasture. So it's important to understand that as we move forward. Just like pasture renovation, when we talk about weed control in pastures, we need to think about it as a multi-pronged integrated approach that involves the soil fertility, the type of forage species that we choose. Some forage species are better adapted than others, the type of grazing management we have, and then the use of herbicides. So all of those things are an important part of weed control programs. If we base our weed control program solely on herbicides, we're not going to be successful. It's like a revolving door. You go out in your pasture and there's some great herbicides out there. Don't get me wrong, great herbicides with some good residual value too. But you apply it, you kill a weed, what's left? We got a hole in our pasture, right? What grows in a hole in a pasture? Another weed. So if we don't address these other underlying problems, fertility and grazing management, then our weed control program is not going to be successful. So the question was, yeah. So it's a summer annual grass, and it usually comes up where there's a spot in the pasture. So when you have an open spot, some type of summer annual grass is going to come up there, and a lot of times it's foxtail. There are some herbicides that will keep that seed from germinating. They're labeled and used mostly in hay fields for high quality hay production, and that would be Prowl H2O. But other than that, the best defense against weeds is getting something to grow in that spot where that foxtail is coming up that you want. So I don't have a good solution other than keeping your pasture stand as healthy and as closed as you possibly can to keep those summer annual weeds from germinating. I don't think it's quite as big of an issue in cattle than it is in horses. Generally, we don't want foxtail species in horse hay because it causes abscesses to form in the mouth of the animal. So just mention overseeding with legumes. Um, my predecessor, Dr. Lacefield, was real big on legumes, and I'm big on legumes. I think they're an important part of grazing systems. We all know the benefits. They fix nitrogen from the air and bring nitrogen into the grazing system. One thing to understand about that is that we often make like putting clover in a pasture is like the same thing as putting a bag of fertilizer, but it doesn't quite work like that, right? So there's nitrogen in the clover, but that nitrogen is not directly shared with the grass plant. It has to be shared indirectly through the grazing animal. So the animal eats that clover, gets that nitrogen, and then excretes that nitrogen in urine and dung back onto the pasture. And over time, we build what we call a nutrient cycle. And there's lots of different things involved in the nutrient cycle. There's bacteria and fungi and insects and the animal are all important parts of the nutrient cycle. Of course, we increase yields and improve forage quality and animal performance. Improve summer growth, especially a deep-rooted thing like alfalfa or Sericea lespedeza, which you'll find on some reclaimed mine land in this region. Probably the most important thing for us if we're working with toxic fescue is we need to have clover in there to dilute the endophyte. We always called that a dilution effect, but what we're finding out is there's more than that going on in a pasture. We're not only diluting that, but there's some compounds in red clover called isoflavones, and those isoflavones are actually counteracting the negative effect of the toxins in tall fescue. Pretty interesting research happening in Lexington at our USDA forage animal research unit. All right, just a few tips for frost seeding success. You want to reduce the amount of residue on a soil surface because that means graze your pastures closely because you want that seed to get to the soil. You want to have adequate freeze-thaw cycles left, so that means you get it out in February so that we have the freezing and thawing to incorporate that seed. It looks like we're going to get some freezing and thawing this week. And you want to get the seed on early to ensure adequate freeze-thaw cycles and use high-quality seed, correct seeding rate, and even seed distribution. That's easy to say when you're standing up here, but when you're driving a four-wheeler through a pasture, it's the best guess at where you're throwing seed, right? So one of the things we did last year was we actually bought a little GPS unit for our ATV at the research station. That may have been one of the best investments that we've made. The row crop guys know that, right? They've been using GPS guidance for a decade and a half or 2 decades. Us livestock guys are a little bit behind the technology curve sometimes, but once you use one of these, you'll really appreciate it. We used it this summer to spray, spread broiler litter, um, spread some fertilizer, broadcast clover seed. We did one other operation, I can't remember what it was. And that little unit was amazing. Oh, we actually used the drill, because sometimes when you're drilling a pasture, you think you'd be able to see where you're going, but sometimes if the sun's right, you can't quite see where your last drill swath was. This will show you exactly where you need to be. So the interesting thing is there's some of these on the market that are used now that you can get for a relatively reasonable price. And then the last thing when we overseed clover is we need to control competition, post-seeding competition. So when we get our clover on the pasture, the best thing we can do is put some animals on it, feed some hay on that pasture, and just let them pick around in that pasture. Because what that's doing is it's keeping competition from that existing sod down. When those seedlings come up and they start to get nipped off, that's when we need to move those animals off that pasture. A lot of times people get so afraid of trampling a few seedlings that they'll just take the animals off, and that sod will grow around those seedlings and shade them out, and that can often result in stand failures. All right, I want to change gears just a little bit and talk about a renovation program that works on your farm, and kind of starting where we're at right now today in looking at the next 12 months and thinking about some strategies that we might use to renovate pastures with. So timing's everything when we seed grasses, right? When we seed cool season grasses, the ideal time in my mind to seed them is in late summer, early fall. That's probably the best time in Western Kentucky to seed a cool season grass. And unfortunately, it was really dry this fall during that time period, which made pasture renovation difficult. If you haven't seeded by now, you really mixed your window for seeding this fall. So we need to think about what we're going to do to move forward from here. Do nothing. Doesn't seem like a great option, right? But sometimes it's important that we be patient, and that certainly is one option. So if we do nothing now, what it'll allow us to do is focus on really doing a timely seeding in the spring, and really getting our cool season grasses out in the spring seeding when we need to. And that's really important to have success with the spring seeding. I'm not a big proponent of spring seedings. I prefer fall seedings, but we can get in the middle of February to mid-April and interseed those pastures with cool season grasses and hope that they make it through. And there's some advantages to doing nothing. Allows us timely seeding in the spring, and we have adequate moisture. Sometimes too much moisture, right? And excessive moisture in the spring, one of the disadvantages, could delay seeding, and that can be a problem because that's going to push you closer to the summer months. As you get pushed a cool season grass seeding closer to the summer months, we're going to tend to have more summer stress on those new stands. We want to make sure we get them in early so they can get a root system down and get established before the summer really comes in hard. The other problem is summer annual weeds in spring seedings, and that's why I really dislike spring seedings. It's just hard to control summer annual weeds. We can do pretty good with the broadleaves. We can spray just a little bit of 2,4-D. Once those seedlings have 4-colored leaves, we can spray things like spiny amaranth and cocklebur with a little bit of 2,4-D when they're young and in the seedling stage, and do a pretty good job controlling those. But what we can't control is things like summer annual grasses, foxtails, crabgrass, goosegrass, and so forth. And they can be very tough on spring seedings. And a lot of times they'll lead to failures in spring seeding. So that summer annual weeds is a difficult thing to control. The take home is that while this is an option, it's probably not ideal to do a spring seeding. You're probably better off to wait and do a seeding next fall in a timely manner. So what can we do right now? One thing that we can do right now is probably for another week or so is seed some small grain in these pastures. And we can seed 2 to 3 bushels of wheat or cereal rye at this point. If you're a gambling man, you could throw a little annual ryegrass in if you wanted, but it's getting late for annual ryegrass even. So, but I think a wheat or a cereal rye, if we get a few warm days a little bit later on this month, we'll probably do okay. The advantage is it's going to make a canopy on that field eventually. It's going to seed, and that's going to shade out some weeds. And then we'll have something to graze or cut in the spring. So you're not going to get any growth to mount to anything this fall or winter, but you're going to get some growth this spring. And that can be pretty important. If you come through a tough winter that was wet and cold, like we had last winter, and like today was, those are pretty tough on cows. And if we have something really high quality to go on to in the spring, that can put some condition back on those cows, especially if your hay is a little bit marginal in forage quality. The disadvantages with a small grain is once you cut it in the spring, it's done, right? We remove that growing point. We don't get any substantial growth from a small grain. The other disadvantage is if we do a small grain now, we're not going to be able to do a spring seeding. So that's just something you have to consider if you're going to go this route. So what do we do after that small grain? And that's kind of where summer annuals come in. I think this is a better system than trying to do a spring seeding. So we'll do a small grain in the fall if we can get it in, or in annual ryegrass. And then we come on in the spring after that plays out. So depending on what you overseed, that'll be somewhere in May or June. And you can come in with a summer annual and then manage that for grazing or for hay during the summer months. And then that'll set you up. They'll suppress weeds and set you up to seed timely in the fall with a perennial grass stand. So we could do Sudan grass or pearl millet. I would tend to avoid crabgrass. I'm a crabgrass fan, but if you're going to go back into a perennial grass, I would tend to avoid crabgrass as a summer annual. So sorghum Sudan grass or a pearl millet will work fine, or even a Sudan grass hybrid. So advantages is it's going to suppress weed growth. It's going to give you grazing or haying during the summer months. When we've got an active canopy there, it's going to greatly reduce the amount of weeds that we have germinate in that field, especially something that's very aggressive in growth like a Sudan grass. And I tend to like Sudan grass for weed suppression because it just gets out of the ground so fast and gets a canopy formed over those weeds. And it's going to allow us to do a timely seeding in the fall. Disadvantages, of course, if we have a drought in the summer, it's going to limit growth, but it's going to limit growth of everything. And it can be hard to keep hay or grazed in the summertime. Anybody that's ever worked with summer annuals know it looks great one day, and the next day it's 6 feet tall if we've got good growing conditions. So you've really got to be on top of management in terms of both haying and grazing if you're going to use a summer annual in this system. All right, and then I just want to mention a late summer seeding of cool season grasses and things to think about so that you can have success with that. So we want to choose an adapted cool season grass. Probably our best adapted grass is tall fescue. Love it or hate it, it's what is best adapted here. And our choices are really three. We can use a toxic endophyte. That's like an old Kentucky 31 that's got the toxic endophyte that causes lower animal performance. Some cases, I mean, that may be your best option. We can use an endophyte free, which doesn't have the problems associated with the endophyte. But when we take that endophyte out, that plant becomes less vigorous and a little bit weaker. So we've got to have better grazing management to maintain it. And it's not going to be as hardy when we get under stress. The third option, the newest one, is the development of the novel endophyte. And that's an endophyte in that grass plant that gives it increased tolerance to stresses. Not quite as good as Kentucky 31, but pretty good. But it doesn't form the toxins associated with poor animal performance. So that's a great option, and there's a new variety on the market called Lacefield, named after Dr. Gary Lacefield from Princeton. It was developed at the University of Kentucky and Dr. Phillips' breeding program, and that's commercially available now. So we'll do a timely, so we want to do a timely seeding, not a spring seeding. I made a typo there, but a late summer seeding. And we want to do that in late August. I always say after the first good rain in August and to early October. We don't want to push it much past early October if we can avoid it. And then we want nitrogen at seeding, ideally, to help the grasses tiller and grow during the fall. And then another shot of nitrogen in the spring. Some people will leave this out, but I think that second shot of nitrogen in late February, early March on a new stand of cool season grasses is really important. It helps that grass get established and get off to a good growth in the spring to help shade out weeds. And then we want to graze lightly in spring and summer. So one thing that's extremely important to remember with perennial grasses is they tend to grow a little bit slower than an annual. They're making an investment in the root system underneath the ground. So instead of putting all their energy in the top of the plant, they're investing in their root system. So they're not fully established until about 18 to 24 months after we plant them. So we want to let them go through that first year without really hammering them in that first year in terms of grazing real frequently or real closely. And if we're making hay, go ahead and let it get a seed head on it for that first cutting. And that'll let that plant put a little bit of energy down into the base of the plant and store up some carbohydrates. So this is kind of my renovation checklist. Soil test, adjust fertility as needed, choose an adapted forage species, manage pasture during critical periods. So when you have drought or flood, manage pastures accordingly. Control broadleaf weeds in your pastures, and remember integrated weed control. So it's just not herbicides, but it's all these things that we've been talking about. Incorporate legumes back into pastures, and then design and implement a renovation strategy that's kind of fit the needs of your farm. Any questions on that before I talk just 2 slides on hay testing? Carpet grass. Not sure what is a carpet grass? Are you talking about Bermuda grass or? One long stem, the leaf wrapped around the stalk, got hairs on it, a little narrow leaf on it. Is it called carpet grass or is it? It looks like a weed. So it's not little barley, is it? It's not. Yeah. I'm not familiar with that, so I'm going to have to look that up when I go back. Small carpet grass. I'm going to take a look at that. Generally speaking, all these weed species, if we can get a good sod of tall fescue, is going to exclude a lot of weed species. Okay. All right. Any other questions? So the question was what's the best way to put nitrogen back into pastures? So chemical fertilizer is certainly an option, and I think used in moderate amounts, it's okay. The best way ultimately is to include legumes in your grazing system and start to build a strong nitrogen cycle within that grazing system. Anything we can do to reduce the amount of inputs we need in the grazing system is going to be good for the bottom line. So overseeding your clover or pastures with clover on a regular basis would be a good way to help bring nitrogen into that grazing system. And then good grazing management will help get that nitrogen cycling through that system. Do you have any other questions? All right, I'm going to just mention hay testing real quick because I think it's so important, especially as we're going into a cold winter and we're going to be feeding a lot of hay this winter. So a lot of poor quality hay made this spring. We had good spring moisture, which we were blessed with, but that delays hay cutting, and when we delay hay cutting, the quality of the hay goes down substantially. We just finished sampling, running 600 samples from the eastern part of the state, and hay quality was was marginal in those samples for a lactating brood cow. So keep your eye on hay quality. A lot of this hay is not going to meet the requirements of a fall calving cow that's lactating with a calf by her side. Get a hay test. It's going to help us design a supplementation program. It's better to supplement as you go along than try to catch up later on. It's much harder to catch up. So getting a hay test will tell you where you're at, and then allow you to develop a cost-effective supplementation program that will keep your cows from slipping condition. So make sure you get a good sample. So sample every hay lot separately. So a hay lot is one cutting of hay made from a given field. That's one hay lot. Sample that separately. I like to get 20 cores if I can get. If it's a larger hay lot, I'll get at least 20 cores from that larger hay lot, and then send them in for analysis. You can send them into Waters Lab. You can send it into Dairyland or Dairy One, or the Kentucky Department of Agriculture has a hay testing program also that we can send the samples into. And Kevin Laurent and Jeff Lemcooler made up this great tool. I'm sure everybody in here has seen this. It's the UK beef cow forage supplementation tool. That's a mouthful, but it's a neat tool. So you get your results back from the test, and you just enter them in this tool. Dry matter, crude protein, neutral turgid fiber. That tells us how much of that forage that animal will be able to eat in the day. And then total digestible nutrients or energy in that forage. And then you choose what supplements that you would like to use or have available to you. And then you just hit calculate, and it goes through and shows you how much of these different supplements in this tool that you'll need to feed to make sure that your animal's getting the right amount of energy and crude protein. This is just a tool. It's not perfect, and it's not ration balancing software. It's just kind of a supplementation tool. It's going to give you an idea of how much supplement you'll need to get those cows through on a given hay lot. I'd just like to show you a couple of resources while we finish up here. This is our Forages website. If you're interested in learning more about Forages, just search UK Forages. It'll be the first thing that pops up on your search engine. It's got upcoming events. It's got publications on all these different things, grazing management and soil fertility. It's got a little section called Forage News, and you can actually subscribe to the Forage News. Then once a month, it'll send you an email with the Forage News. We're very regular on that. It comes out the beginning of every month. This is a YouTube channel that we have. It's called KY Forages. It's got several hundred videos on it of presentations like this one and many more. The presentations from last week's Forage Conference with Jim Garish was here. They're on this YouTube channel. All you need to do to get to this is just search KY Forages YouTube, and it'll pop right up. We've got lots of information on forage varieties. We've got probably one of the largest variety testing programs in the eastern United States here in Kentucky. Great resources. Sometimes the amount of information on here is overwhelming when we look at individual tests, but the publication to go to are these long-term summaries. So what this does is it tells you how a variety is performed over multiple years. And we want to select varieties that have performed well, better than average, for multiple years of the test. And that's kind of how this summary is laid out. And then we've got the Forage News, and if you go to the upper left-hand corner of the Forage page and just click right here to subscribe and put your email in, you'll get a copy of the Forage News email letter every month. All right. Is there any questions? And it can be on anything. When you're what? So what's in your ration other than hay? I say hay quality is always important, and you'll want to balance the ration for the hay quality. So especially if you're receiving calves, you want a good soft hay to receive those calves on. Are you bringing calves in to feed them? Yeah, so you want a good soft hay to get them on feed and get the rumen straightened out when you get them. But getting a hay test and just balancing it for that ration can probably save you some money, especially if you get a better quality hay, and you can reduce your supplementation. Other questions? All right. I'll be around for a little bit, so if you have any questions, just grab me and I'll be happy to try to answer them best I can. Thank you.